Sweetwater Valley, Wyoming Territory. March 19, 1888. Rebecca Carter's boots hit the snow before she realized her husband wasn't stopping to let her rest. The wagon wheels kept turning. The wind kept screaming. And Ethan Carter kept staring straight ahead, his jaw locked tight beneath his hat, as if looking at her might break something inside him that he had already decided to destroy. Ethan. The wind swallowed her voice whole. She called his name again, louder this time, one hand pressed against the swell of her stomach, the other reaching for the side of the wagon that was pulling away from her. He didn't slow down. He threw her travel bag into the snow beside her, and it landed with a dull, final thump that told her everything before he said a single word. "I won't raise another man's child." The sentence came out of him like a blade he'd been sharpening for weeks. Rebecca staggered forward through the drifts, her breath tearing out of her in white clouds. "It is your baby, Ethan. I swear to you, on everything I have left, it is your baby." He didn't believe her. She could see it in the way his shoulders stayed rigid, the way his eyes refused to meet hers even for a second. Someone had gotten to him. Someone had poured poison into his ear, and he had drunk every drop of it without ever once asking her the truth. The wagon disappeared into the white wall of the blizzard. Rebecca stood alone in the middle of Sweetwater Valley, snow burying her ankles, wind cutting through her coat like it wasn't even there. She placed a trembling hand over her stomach and looked toward the mountains where her husband had vanished. "If we survive this," she whispered to the child inside her, "I'll make sure you become a better man than your father." If you've ever had someone believe a lie over you without asking a single question, stay with this one until the end. Hit subscribe right now, because what this little boy does 5 years later to the man who abandoned them is going to break you in the best way. Let's get into it. 5 years later, Sweetwater Valley, late spring 1893. A wooden bridge snapped beneath the weight of a horse. The horse screamed. The man on its back went under. Timber cracked apart like kindling, and the river swallowed both of them into water so cold it stopped a man's heart before it stopped his breathing. Ethan Carter fought the current with everything he had left, his boots filling, his coat dragging him down like iron chains, the world narrowing into one single, desperate question. Would anyone find him before the river did? He went under once, twice. The current slammed him against a half-submerged log and he clawed at the bark, fingers numb, lungs burning, the gray sky spinning above him every time his head broke the surface. He was losing. He knew he was losing. And then through the roar of water he heard a voice, a boy's voice. "Grab the rope. Grab it now." Ethan turned his head and saw him standing on the bank, small, maybe 5 years old, feet planted wide in the mud, both hands wrapped around a length of rope he had tied off to a fallen tree with more skill than most grown men could manage. The boy didn't scream. He didn't panic. He simply threw the rope with a calm precision that felt wrong for someone his size, and when Ethan caught it, the boy dug his heels into the bank and pulled with everything his small body had. It shouldn't have been enough. Somehow it was. Ethan collapsed onto the mud, coughing up river water, his whole body shaking. When he finally looked up, the boy was crouched beside him, unbothered, as if hauling a grown man out of a flood was something he did every week. "You all right, mister?" Ethan could only nod. The boy smiled, a gap-toothed, easy smile that didn't belong to a child who just watched a stranger nearly drown. "My mama says you never leave folks behind." The words hit Ethan somewhere he couldn't name. He didn't understand why. He only knew that something about this child, the shape of his jaw, the steadiness in his eyes, the way he'd tied that rope, made the back of Ethan's neck go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the river. "What's your name, boy?" "Samuel." Why did this little boy feel so familiar? Samuel helped him to his feet, slung one of Ethan's arms over his small shoulders like he'd rescued grown men before, and started walking him up the trail toward a thin line of smoke rising over the ridge. "Come on," Samuel said. "Mom'll fix you up." Ethan followed him without a word because his legs were shaking too hard to argue, and because some part of him, some part he didn't yet have language for, didn't want to let this boy out of his sight. They crested the ridge and a small cabin came into view, smoke curling from its chimney, a garden fenced against deer, a horse grazing near the barn. Samuel called out before they even reached the door, "Mama, I found a man in the river." The door opened. Everything stopped. Rebecca Carter stood in the doorway, 5 years older, her hair pulled back beneath a faded blue kerchief, her hands still damp from washing. For one full second, neither of them breathed. The wind moved between them and neither one noticed. Will Rebecca help the man who abandoned her? Her hand tightened on the doorframe. For a moment, Ethan was certain she was going to shut the door in his face, and some ugly, honest part of him thought she'd be right too. But instead, her voice came out low and even, stripped of everything except duty. "Bring him inside." She didn't look at him as she said it. She looked at Samuel, and something in her face softened only for the boy, and Ethan understood, standing there dripping river water onto her porch, that whatever warmth still lived in this woman had nowhere left in it reserved for him. Inside, she worked in silence. She peeled off his soaked coat, wrapped a wool blanket around his shoulders, set a kettle over the fire, and began cleaning a gash along his forearm he hadn't even noticed he had. Her hands were steady. Her jaw was tight. She never once forgave him with her eyes, not even for a second, and Ethan realized this wasn't mercy. This was simply who she was. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly. "I'm not doing it for you." She didn't look up from the bandage. "I'm doing it because that's what decent people do." "Rebecca, I don't." Her hands didn't stop moving, wrapping the bandage tight, efficient, clinical. "Whatever you're about to say, save it. I don't want your apology. I don't want your explanation. I want you warm enough to ride out of here in the morning." "I read the letters wrong. I believed the wrong man." "I know exactly what you believed, Ethan Carter. I lived it." Her voice cracked, just barely, the first sound of anything other than iron control she'd let slip since he'd stepped through her door. "I buried our first winter alone in a dugout with a baby coming and a husband who couldn't be bothered to ask his own wife a single question before he decided she was a liar. So no, you don't get to apologize your way out of that tonight. Not tonight, and maybe not ever." She tied off the bandage and stood, gathering the basin of water without another glance in his direction. Samuel sat cross-legged near the fire, watching the two adults with the sharp, quiet attentiveness of a child who understood something was happening that no one was explaining to him. He didn't ask questions. He just watched Ethan the way a person watches a puzzle they can't quite solve. Nobody explained anything. The silence in that cabin was louder than the blizzard outside had ever been. Outside, unnoticed by any of them, two men in dark coats moved along the tree line at the edge of Rebecca's property, driving wooden stakes into the frozen ground every 20 paces, unrolling a survey chain behind them like they already owned every inch of it. The next morning, one of them knocked on Rebecca's door and removed his hat with false politeness. "Ma'am, I'm obligated to inform you. The railroad owns this land now." Rebecca stared at him for a long moment. Then she laughed, short and sharp, a sound with no humor in it at all. "No," she said, "I do." The man simply handed her a folded document and walked away without another word, leaving her standing on her own porch, holding a piece of paper that claimed to erase everything she'd built alone for 5 winters. How does someone lose land they've owned for years, overnight, with no warning at all? Rebecca rode into town the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. Samuel bundled beside her, Ethan trailing behind on a borrowed horse because he had nowhere else to go and no strength yet to argue about it. The county office was a narrow building with a stove that smoked more than it warmed, and the clerk behind the counter, an older man named Whitfield, went pale the moment Rebecca said her name. "I need my deed," Rebecca said. "The original filing. Carter Land, West Section, filed in '86. Whitfield's hands trembled as he searched through drawer after drawer. "It's not here, Mrs. Carter." "Then find where it went." "I can't." His voice cracked. "It isn't in the ledger anymore either. Someone's removed the page." Rebecca's face didn't change, but her knuckles went white against the counter. Later that afternoon, as she stepped out to load supplies onto the wagon, Whitfield caught Ethan alone near the stable, glancing over his shoulder twice before speaking. "Wait," the old clerk said, voice low. "Just you, come with me." He led Ethan into a back room and knelt in front of a locked drawer built into the floorboards, his hands shaking as he worked the key. "I couldn't destroy these," Whitfield said. "God forgive me, I couldn't do it. Not after what they did to that family." Inside the drawer were copies of Rebecca's original land deed, carefully preserved. And beneath them, tied with twine, a thick stack of letters, dozens of them, every one addressed to Ethan Carter and never delivered. Ethan's hands shook as he untied the string. The first letter read, "Our son took his first steps today. I wish you had been here to see it, but I understand why you couldn't come." The second, "I still believe you'll come home. I have to believe it or none of this makes sense." Letter after letter. 5 years of a woman writing to a husband who never once wrote back, because he never once received a single word she sent. A third letter, dated barely 6 months after he'd left, made his stomach turn over completely. "I named him Samuel after your grandfather, the way we always said we would if it was a boy. I hope that's all right. I hope, wherever you are, you're warm." Another, written in a hand that looked rushed, the ink smeared like it had been written through tears. "I walked to the post office again today. Mr. Doyle tells me nothing's come for you to collect. I don't understand why you won't even send word that you're alive. But I'll keep writing. I told you I would make him a better man than his father, and I intend to keep that promise whether you ever read a single word of this or not." Ethan pressed the back of his hand against his mouth and sat there a long while, the letters spread across his knees like evidence at a trial where he already knew the verdict. "How long have you had these?" he finally asked, without looking up. Whitfield's voice was barely above a whisper. "Since the 2nd year. The postmaster brought them here instead of destroying them, I believe out of some scrap of conscience he still had left, and he asked me to hold on to them in case the truth ever came due. I should have brought them to you the moment they arrived. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself a great many things, Mr. Carter, to let myself sleep at night." "Why tell me now?" "Because that boy," Whitfield said, "pulled a grown man out of a river with a length of rope and good sense alone. Because I watched him ride into town beside his mother, and I thought about my own boys, and I thought, what kind of man lets a lie outlive the truth for 5 years when the truth was sitting locked in a drawer the whole time?" Ethan sat on the floor of that back room and read every letter twice, and somewhere around the 11th one, the shape of the last 5 years cracked open in front of him, and he finally understood. Rebecca never stopped reaching for him. He had simply never been given the chance to hear her. Who kept these letters hidden, and who benefited from a marriage destroyed this completely? That evening back at the cabin, Ethan sat on the porch step trying to repair a fence rail with hands that still hurt from the river, and without thinking about it, he began to whistle an old tune his own father had taught him. A few feet away, Samuel picked up a second hammer and started whistling the exact same melody, note for note, without ever having heard Ethan hum it before. Rebecca watched from the window, and something in her chest quietly broke in half. She said nothing. She simply turned away from the glass and went back to her work, because there were some truths a person had to carry alone for a while before they could say them out loud. The following days moved like a held breath. Ethan stayed to mend fences and haul water, not because Rebecca invited him to, but because neither of them found the words to send him away, and Samuel kept finding reasons to walk beside him, asking him how to knot a rope tighter, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to tell if a horse was favoring a leg. Ethan answered every question like it was the most important thing he'd ever been asked, because for the first time in 5 years it was. It was Samuel who put the pieces together first, in the way that children sometimes see truths that adults spend years avoiding. He'd wandered near the barn one evening, unnoticed, while Ethan and Rebecca stood arguing in low, urgent voices about the letters, about the deed, about a name neither of them wanted to say out loud in front of him. Samuel froze behind a stack of hay bales and listened to every word, and by the time the conversation ended, he understood two things with total clarity. Ethan Carter was his father, and his father had left them in a blizzard and never once come looking. Samuel didn't cry. He didn't run inside shouting questions. He simply stood up, dusted the hay off his knees, and walked away from the barn with the same quiet steadiness he'd used to pull a drowning man out of a river. He found his mother alone by the woodpile an hour later. "If he loved us," Samuel asked, his voice very small and very even, "why didn't he come?" Rebecca knelt in front of her son and opened her mouth, and found, for the first time in 5 years, that she had no answer at all. The man behind all of it had a name, and it belonged to Silas Granger, owner of the Western Frontier Rail Company, a man who had ridden through Sweetwater Valley years earlier and recognized something the Carters never had. Their land sat over the only safe mountain pass for 100 miles, and Rebecca's inheritance made it legally untouchable. Destroy the marriage. Destroy the legal protection that came with it. That had been the plan from the very beginning. Silas had bribed the town doctor to plant doubt in Ethan's ear about the timing of the pregnancy. He'd bribed the postmaster to make sure not a single one of Rebecca's letters ever reached her husband. He'd bribed Ethan's own ranch foreman to whisper the final, poisonous lie that broke a marriage in one blizzard-soaked night. One lie, carefully planted in 5 different mouths, had cost a family 5 years. Ethan had never asked Rebecca a single question before he threw her bag into the snow. He had simply believed strangers over his own wife, and that failure sat in his chest now like a stone he would carry the rest of his life. He confronted the foreman himself, riding 2 days to the man's new post on a ranch outside Casper, and found him mucking out a stable, thinner than Ethan remembered, older around the eyes. "Why?" was all Ethan could manage. The foreman didn't even try to lie. "Granger paid me more in 1 week than you paid me in a year. He told me all I had to do was mention a name. Just one name at the right moment, when you were tired and scared and half out of your mind with worry over the baby coming early. He said men believe the worst thing they're told when they're already afraid. He was right, wasn't he? You knew what it would do to her, to us." "I knew," the foreman admitted, not looking up from the stall. "I told myself it wasn't my business what a man believed about his own wife. I've thought about it near every day since. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't reckon I deserve it." Ethan rode home that night with nothing settled and everything confirmed, and somewhere on that long ride through the dark he understood that blame, once he started handing it out, had more than one name attached to it. Granger's, the doctor's, the postmaster's, the foreman's, and his own. Can a man ever forgive himself for something like that? By the time Ethan and Rebecca realized Samuel had heard everything, the boy was already gone. A note sat folded on his pillow, written in careful, uneven letters. "I need to know who I am." Rebecca's hands went cold reading it. She knew instantly, without needing to guess twice, exactly where her son had gone. Eagle Pass. The same mountain route Ethan had disappeared into 5 years earlier, the same brutal stretch of terrain that had nearly killed Ethan on his own wedding night ride home, years before any of this had started. Outside, the sky had gone the color of a bruise. The wind had shifted. A blizzard was building over the ridge with the kind of speed that only happened in the high country, and somewhere out in that storm, a 5-year-old boy was riding alone. History was repeating itself, and this time Ethan Carter had a choice to make. Would he ride away from this family again, or would he finally ride into the storm for them? Every rancher within 10 miles saddled up within the hour. Torches, rope, blankets. Rebecca rode at the front of the search line despite every man telling her to stay behind, her face carved from the same stone as her son's had been an hour earlier. "You should let the men go first," one of the older ranchers told her, not unkindly, as they crossed the first ridge into the worsening wind. "He's my son," Rebecca said, and that was the end of the conversation. Ethan rode beside her, saying nothing for a long while until the trail narrowed and forced them into single file. "Rebecca, don't. I have to say it, if we don't find him." "We will find him." Her voice didn't waver, though her eyes were bright with something she refused to let fall. "I have spent 5 years finding my way through every kind of storm this valley can throw at a person, Ethan Carter, and I am not about to stop now because you're frightened. Ride, or get out of my way." He rode. Silas Granger, meanwhile, refused to halt his blasting cruise despite the worsening weather, determined to finish clearing the mountain pass before the storm made it impossible. Somewhere in that decision, greed outrunning good sense, the explosion went off exactly where it shouldn't have, and a section of mountainside let go all at once. The avalanche came down with a sound like the whole world tearing in half. Snow and shattered pine crashed down the slope in a wall 40 feet high, and directly in its path, Samuel's horse reared and threw him into a shallow ravine seconds before the full weight of it buried the trail behind him. Ethan reached the ravine first, ahead of every other rider, his horse half dead from the climb, his own hand split open and bleeding from clawing through drifts too deep to ride through. He found Samuel trapped beneath fallen pine and packed snow, barely conscious, his small body already shivering into the dangerous stillness that came right before a person stopped shivering altogether. Ethan could have ridden for help. He could have saved himself the risk of staying in a storm that was actively trying to kill him. Instead, he dropped to his knees and began digging with his bare hands, tearing through snow and broken branches until his fingers stopped feeling like fingers at all. He pulled off his own coat and wrapped it around his son. He gave him his gloves. He gave him what little food he'd carried, and when the horse could no longer be ridden safely, he gave Samuel the last of the warmth from the animal's body, pressing the boy against its side to slow the cold eating into him. He refused to leave, not when the wind picked up, not when the temperature dropped further, not even when his own body began to shake so hard he could barely speak. "Stay with me," he kept saying over and over to a boy who might not even survive the night. "Stay with me, Samuel. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not leaving you, not this time." Night fell over the ravine, and still he stayed, shielding his son's small body with his own, refusing every instinct that told him to move, to run, to save himself the way he'd saved himself once before by simply walking away. The ranchers found them just before dawn, both of them nearly frozen, but both of them alive. They pulled Samuel free first, wrapped him in 3 blankets and got him moving toward the nearest fire. When they reached for Ethan, his hands were so stiff around his son's coat that 2 grown men had to pry his fingers loose, one at a time. The valley learned the whole truth within days. Silas Granger's illegal blasting, done in direct violation of every safety order on record, exposed the full scope of his fraud once investigators started digging through his company's records. The bribed doctor confessed. The corrupt postmaster confessed. The foreman, facing prison, confessed everything, down to the exact words Silas had told him to whisper in Ethan's ear 5 years earlier. Silas Granger lost his company, his contracts, and every acre he'd ever tried to steal. Rebecca's land and her name were fully restored. If you're still here, drop a comment telling me what you'd have done in Ethan's position and hit that like button, because the ending of this one is going to stay with you. Months passed. Sweetwater Valley healed the way frontier towns always healed, slowly, through work and weather and time. Everyone in town assumed, quietly, that Ethan and Rebecca would remarry now that the truth had come out, and the land was safe again. It seemed like the obvious ending to the story they'd all watched unfold. It wasn't the ending Ethan chose. Instead, on a cold morning in early autumn, he rode into town alone and sat across from his lawyer at a small wooden desk and quietly signed away every acre of Carter Ranch. Every fence post, every head of cattle, every building he'd spent a decade building with his own hands. His lawyer stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "You understand what you're giving up, Mr. Carter." "I understand exactly what I'm giving up." He rode out to Rebecca's cabin that same afternoon and told her what he'd done. She stood on the porch, arms crossed against the cold, studying his face for a long moment before she finally asked the question. "Why?" "Because I chose that ranch over my family once," Ethan said. "I'm not going to spend the rest of my life proving I've changed while I'm still holding onto the thing I chose instead of you. I don't deserve to keep both. I don't think I even deserve to keep one. But I'm not going to keep it and call myself a different man. That's not how this works." He walked away from everything he owned and started over as a hired hand on a neighboring ranch, mucking stalls and mending fences for wages, not because anyone forced him to, and not because it earned him anything back. He did it because, for the first time in his life, he finally understood what mattered and what didn't, and land had never been on that list. Rebecca never once asked him to give it up. She never asked him to come back either. Samuel began visiting him not long after. Once a month at first, careful and uncertain, the two of them working side by side in near silence, learning each other the way strangers learn a language. Then every couple of weeks. Then every Saturday without fail, rain or snow or blistering summer heat. Years passed that way. Ethan never missed a single visit. He never once broke a promise to his son. Not a small one, not a large one. And slowly, the way trust rebuilds itself one repaired fence at a time, Samuel stopped visiting out of obligation and started visiting because he wanted to. There was the winter Samuel broke his arm falling from a hayloft, and Ethan rode 4 miles through fresh snow in the middle of the night the moment word reached him, sitting at the boy's bedside until dawn without once being asked to. There was the summer Samuel wanted to learn to break a horse properly, and Ethan spent every Saturday for 2 months teaching him patience before he ever led him near the saddle, telling him, "A horse doesn't forget cruelty, son, and neither do people. Best to never give either one a reason to remember you unkindly." Samuel never forgot that lesson. Neither did his mother, who watched from a distance and said nothing but noticed everything. By the time Samuel turned 12, he'd started calling him something other than Mr. or Ethan. It came out sideways the first time, almost by accident, over a meal of beans and cornbread after a long day mending fence line. "Pass the salt, Pa." Ethan went very still, the word landing somewhere deep in his chest, and he passed the salt without trusting himself to say anything back for a full minute. "You all right?" Samuel asked. "I'm all right," Ethan managed. "Just glad is all." One autumn afternoon, Samuel arrived at the small bunkhouse where Ethan lived, carrying a broken saddle over one shoulder, now a tall, steady young man with his mother's eyes and his father's hands. "I thought maybe," Samuel said quietly, setting the saddle down between them, "my father could show me how to fix this." Ethan's hands began to shake, the same way they'd shaken in that ravine years earlier, except this time it wasn't from the cold. Rebecca watched the whole exchange from her porch a quarter-mile away, close enough to see her son call this man his father for the very first time out loud. Ethan started walking toward her without thinking, some old instinct pulling him forward, but she gently raised a hand and stopped him before he reached the steps. "I forgave you," she said, her voice calm and clear. "A long time ago, actually. Holding onto that anger wasn't doing anything except keeping me tied to you, and I decided I didn't want to be tied to anyone anymore. Not even in anger." She paused, letting the wind settle between them. "But forgiveness doesn't rebuild a marriage, Ethan. I learned how to live without you. I built a whole life without you in it, and it's a good life. You'll always be Samuel's father. Nothing will ever change that, and nothing should. But I'm no longer your wife, and I'm not going to become her again just because the story feels like it should end that way." "I'm not asking you to," Ethan said quietly. "I stopped believing I deserved that a long time ago." "I know," Rebecca said, and for the first time in years, something like warmth crossed her face, brief and genuine. "That's actually how I know you've changed. The old Ethan would have asked anyway." She walked back inside, unhurried, with no anger left in her at all. Only peace, the kind that only comes after someone has fully finished grieving something. Years later, Samuel graduated from the Territorial College in Cheyenne, the first in either of his families to do so. He stood in front of family and neighbors, dressed in his one good suit, and when it came time for introductions, he pointed first to the man standing quietly near the back of the crowd. "This is my father." Then he turned toward the woman beside him, radiant and proud. "This is my mother." He never once said the words "my parents." Not that day and not any day after, and Ethan understood exactly what that meant, and he made his peace with it because he had earned his son back through years of small, unbroken promises. He had never earned his marriage back. He never would. And for the first time in his life, that was a debt he could carry without it crushing him, because some things you don't get to undo. You only get to become someone different around them. March 19, 1888. A father rode away from his family into a blizzard and never looked back. Winter, 1898. That same father stands beside the grown son he spent 10 years earning back, one broken saddle, one repaired fence, one kept promise at a time, not because he was forgiven, because he finally became worthy. The blizzard took one family apart. Only truth, time, and sacrifice could ever bring part of it home again. If this story moved you even a little, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Drop a comment with the one moment that hit you hardest, and share this with someone who needs a reminder that some debts can only be repaid in years, not words. See you in the next story.